Hello, my name is Justin Trapp, and I'm the representative for Group 5. This tutorial will show you how to create a rudimentary video game using GameMaker Studio 2. In order to begin, you will need to have already installed the software, and if you're a beginner following along with the exact tutorial, you'll also need to install the folder of sprites used for this simple game of cat and mouse. Before we're able to begin making the game, you'll need to run GameMaker Studio 2, select Blank Project, and then GML Language. Once you do this, you'll be ready to follow along with the steps shown on screen. Once we're ready to begin, we'll start off by adding in the sprite for the player character. To do this, navigate to the right side of the program and click on Scripts, then click Create and Sprite. You'll then need to click Edit Image in the tab that appears, before selecting the Image drop-down menu at the top of the screen and clicking on Import Strip Image. This will allow you to choose your desired sprite. You'll want to choose an image that has multiple frames of movement for your sprite, as shown on screen. You'll then want to make sure the number of frames matches the number of images you want to use for the character model. Then click Convert and exit the Sprite 1 tab. Coming back to the Workspace 1 tab, you'll want to name the sprite for your player character. If you're following along exactly, you'll want to keep the names used on screen for important interactions later on. Change the FPS at the top to match the speed you want your model to transition, then select Collision Mark and change the type to Rectangle in order to create your own custom player hitbox. Once you've done this, you can exit out of the sprite. Then you'll repeat these same steps to add in a weapon for your character to use and name it appropriately. After this, you'll want to navigate to the Rooms folder on the right side of the screen, where you'll click the drop-down option and choose Room 1. This is where you'll set the stage for your character to move. Select Background on the left, then go to the right and click Scripts to add another sprite. This time you'll add in the background image you wish to be behind your character, and instead of choosing Import Strip Image, you'll choose Import Image instead. If the image you import is different in size from the existing canvas space, you'll want to choose a new image or allow the image to be resized. After you've done this, you'll navigate back to Workspace 1, where you'll name the background sprite appropriately. You'll then go to the bottom left of the screen in Background Layer Properties. Click the No Sprite button, then go to the Scripts folder and select your background sprite. Check the horizontal and vertical boxes to fill out the grid with the selected background tile, then alter the width appropriately to change the size of the game room. Scroll down in the Properties section, then enable Viewports and enter Viewport 0 to change the height and width. This will alter the space you see on screen at any given time. Next, go to the right side of the screen and right-click on Objects, then choose Object and name it appropriately. Select the Instances layer on the upper left side, then click the drop-down menu under Objects and drag the object you just created above where the background is visible, as shown. Double-click on your object, click Add Event, then Create. Here you will be able to enter code that will actually set the space you see for the game. Enter the code shown on screen, altering the numbers to match the values you entered earlier for viewports. After you've done this, right-click Objects again and add another object. This one will be for the player. On the collision mask, you'll want to select the player sprite we created earlier, then click Add Event and Step. Here we will enter in code that allows us to move our player character. Enter the code shown on screen, or alter the input controls to your own desired input. Following that code, you'll want to enter the next few lines shown, using appropriate naming conventions that will allow your player character to change animation as they move around the game. Finally, you'll want to enter the speed your character moves for both the horizontal and vertical axis. Next up, you'll want to create a new sprite. Follow the same steps presented earlier and click Import Strip Image, as we'll be selecting the same image we used for the player character. Move the boxes showing which frames are selected and choose an appropriate frame amount. This character sprite will be used for the player's walking animation. Make sure you name this sprite according to the code you used for movement in the player object. Once you finish this process, drag the player object from the right side of the screen to the game room. The player is now able to move around freely, but there aren't any challenges present to truly make this a game. In order to add enemies, we'll first need their sprites. Maneuver to the Sprites section on the right, and right-click to create a new sprite as done earlier. Name the sprite appropriately, choose your desired frames, and import a strip image for the character model. Once you've added the sprite with its correct animation speed, you'll want to make sure you center the sprite appropriately by clicking on the drop-down tab at the top right of the sprite's window. If the sprite is one that crawls as shown on screen, you'll want to change the center to be lower. After that, make sure you set your collision box appropriately, similarly to how we set up the collision box for the player earlier. Now that we have our enemy sprite, we'll want to make it an object. Right-click on the Object tab yet again and add another object named for your enemy. Click No Sprite, then link your enemy animation to the object as we did earlier with the player. After creating the object, click Add Event and Step to begin inputting code for the enemy's movement. Copy the code shown on screen, using appropriate naming conventions and number values for everything you've created so far. Once this is complete, click Add Event again, this time adding a collision. Here, we will enter in code that restarts our character back to the beginning of the game should they be touched by an enemy. Now we can navigate back to Room 1 and drag the enemy objects onto the game room in their appropriate locations. The game could be stopped here if we wanted to simply avoid the enemies for as long as possible, but we want a way to fight back and win. To do this, we'll need to create another object for the weapon we made earlier. Name the weapon object appropriately, link it to its correct sprite, and then click Add Event to add a step. Our character needs to be able to hold their weapon. In order to do this, enter the code shown on screen with the correct name for your player object in order to have the weapon point in the direction of the mouse and be carried by the player. Don't forget to alter the center of the weapon so that your character is holding it in the correct place. Go back to room 1, then drag the weapon into the game room and onto the player. The weapon our character will be using is a ranged one, so we will want to be able to have it fire projectiles. To do this, we'll need to create another object for the projectile. After that, add a new sprite with the appropriate projectile texture, then link it to the object as shown in earlier steps. Once completed, click Add Event on the projectile, then select Collision and mark a collision with the enemy. You'll want to enter the code shown on screen to mark the enemies as defeated once you hit them with a projectile, but in order for the enemies to actually change animation, we'll need to go back to the layer section in the upper left-hand corner and find the button that says Create New Instance Layer, which we will place between the existing layers. Once we've done that, we'll right-click the new layer and click Rename to give it a more specific name. Select the new layer, then go back to the right side to select your enemy object. Click Add Event and select Create. Enter in the code shown on screen, then navigate back to the Steps tab of the enemy object and alter the code as shown. This will allow us to show the enemy as defeated in the game room once we've hit them with a projectile. Like the alternate player model for showing movement, we will need to add in another new sprite for the enemy that shows their defeat animation. To do this, follow the earlier steps, making changes where necessary and naming the sprite so that it correctly interacts with the commands given in the object code. When that is completed, go back to the player object and alter the code as shown. This will finally allow us to shoot our projectile at the enemies. The last step is just to create another layer for the projectiles, at which point the game should be complete. After all that, we're left with a simple but fully functioning video game that allows us to run from enemies and defeat them to win the game. In this tutorial, you learned how to create a player and enemies, and how to set conditions for the player, enemies, and other objects to interact with one another and move around. With these fundamental building blocks, you now possess the ability to make slight alterations that will allow you to create much more complex games in the future. Thank you for watching.